As many of you know, I have a 3-year-old named Teddy, and as you can imagine, he loves to help with almost anything. Whether I'm cooking or working on a small project around the house, he's eager to join in. Now, as any parent knows, a 3-year-old's version of helping usually means things take a little bit longer. The mess is a little bit bigger, and sometimes I'm secretly redoing the work after he's gone. But here's the thing. When I invite him to help, I'm not doing it because I need his help. I can cook without him. I can clean up more quickly on my own, although if truth be told, Abba can clean up more quickly on her own. And I can definitely handle repairs without his help or assistance. But I invite him to participate because I want him to experience the joy of working together, to learn what it means to contribute, to feel part of something bigger than himself. And that's how I think of God's invitation for us to participate in his mission and his work. See, he certainly doesn't need our help to accomplish his purposes. He's fully capable of doing everything on his own, and yet God invites us to participate. Not because he needs us, but because he loves us. Because through our participation, we learn, we grow, and we encounter him more deeply. Today's readings from Hebrews and the Gospel of Mark remind us of this invitation to participate in God's mission. Frankly, everything about this morning reminds us of this invitation to participate in God's mission. But they also show us that this participation involves something deeper. It involves learning obedience. And often that involves entering into the suffering of life and the suffering of others. Let's begin by looking at the passage from Hebrews where we're told that Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. That's the 8th verse of the 5th chapter of Hebrews. And I got to be honest with you, that's hard, for me anyway. First time I read that, Jesus learned obedience. He had a need to learn through what he suffered. See, it's a powerful and in some ways challenging statement. How can the Son of God, who's without sin and perfectly united with the Father, learn obedience? But the key to understanding the passage lies, as usual for me, in the Greek. The word used here for learned is emathen. And it doesn't just mean gaining information through knowledge. It's not sitting through somebody telling you, I learned this. It means something learned through experience. Jesus didn't need to learn how to obey God in this moral sense. He was already perfect in his divinity. But in his humanity, he came to experience obedience in the real world, suffering and hardship. See, he learned that obedience not by avoiding the suffering, but by fully entering into it and by trusting God the Father through it. But then even that word obedience gives me a little bit of pause in this chapter, as though somehow Jesus needs to be obedient to the Father on the cross. There's just something a little bit hard about that. But yet again in the Greek, we find some help in understanding. The Greek word for obedience is hypokon there. And it comes from a root that means to listen attentively. So obedience in this context isn't just about following orders blindly. It's about listening, hearing God's voice, and then responding with trust, even when that trust leads us into difficult places. See, I think In fact, this connection between hearing and obeying is at the heart of what it means to follow God. Some of you might remember the story from Elijah in 1 Kings. It comes from the 19th chapter. And Elijah's seeking God's voice. And he's going through this experience trying to figure out, where can I find God's voice? And there's a terrible wind. And God's voice isn't in the wind. And there's a earthquake that just shatters the place. And God's voice isn't in the earthquake. And then there's a fire, a burning fire. And God's voice isn't in the fire. And then at the end of that passage, it says, there's a small, still voice. A small, still voice. And that's where Elijah hears the voice of God. And see, that teaches us that hearing God requires an attentiveness. It requires a prayerful attentiveness. It's often not loud, dramatic moments where we hear God. But it's the quiet, still moments in the midst of our daily lives, and sometimes in the midst of our suffering. Jesus knew this, and he listened for the Father's voice, and it was through his suffering that he learned the depth of what obedience means. I had a small experience with this week. I was meeting Father Rick for lunch to go over all of this. And I got in my car and had a bit of a drive from my house to where we were meeting for lunch. And I put on a podcast. Many of you, I'm sure, listen to This American Life on NPR, one of my favorite podcasts. And they were talking, it started at the beginning, and all of a sudden I found myself listening to a podcast about the attacks in Israel on October 7th. And they gave that warning that they always give. Hey, if you're listening with kids, this is about to get a little rough. And normally I'm not a kid. I don't pay much attention to that. So they start the podcast, and in the first couple of minutes, there's a recounting of a scene where the attackers show up on October 7th in Israel, and within the first couple of minutes, they shoot the husband in the head, and they shoot the oldest daughter in the chest. And I'm just going to be real honest and candid with you. When I heard, this podcast is about the attacks in Israel on October 7th, my first reaction was, oh, not this again. And also, honestly, the horrors, the way that Israel has carried on this war, I'm not going to get into it, but my first reaction was not one of, I'm excited to hear this. It was sort of, ugh. And then in the scene where the father gets shot and the daughter gets shot, my immediate reaction was, all right, I'm done. I got to shut this off. And there was just something inside me that was, it just hurt. It was, I don't want this. I don't want to do this right now. I don't want to hear this right now. I don't want to be a part of this right now. And in the next moment, there was that voice, not audible, not that, but that voice that called into the suffering. Be a part of it. Go through with these people. It's just a podcast. It's just this little thing. Be a part of it. And so, honestly, against every instinct I had, I kept listening. And the more I kept listening, you have those moments when you're just connected. You're connected to the world. You're connected to God. You're connected to and you're just feeling the feelings in a way that is significant. And I started to have that moment, and as they talked more and more, these people went into captivity, and they were there in these tunnels, and and all of a sudden, they're having this shared experience, the captors and the captured, And they both have families, and they start to talk about their families, and they start to talk about their shared history and how they got them there. And it starts to talk about their shared experience of being human. And I can't really describe for you right now, but it was a profound moment for me. One of those moments that you have where you just have an encounter. And I wouldn't have had it if I hadn't been willing to enter in. If I hadn't been willing to listen to that voice. Have this experience. It's going to be okay. And see, I think this is showing us an important truth about our own lives. Life gives us many opportunities to enter into suffering. Our own suffering and the suffering of other people. In fact, one of the most profound ways we can participate in God's mission is by practicing what I call the ministry of presence, being with other people in their suffering. Even when we don't have answers and we don't have solutions. When someone's grieving or going through a time of deep pain, they often don't need us to say the right thing or fix the situation. What they need is our presence with them in their suffering. To know that they're not alone. To have someone walk alongside them in those moments. And it's in those moments that we're participating in Christ's own ministry because Jesus is the ultimate example of that presence. He didn't come to solve every earthly problem in an instant, but to be with us in our struggles, in our grief, and yes, even in our suffering. And I really think that's what it means to learn obedience through suffering. It doesn't mean that suffering is something we seek out or that it's good in and of itself. But it does mean that when it comes, we don't run from it. We enter into it. Trusting that God is with us through it. And trusting that he's teaching us, shaping us, and revealing his presence in ways we could never experience otherwise. In today's gospel, James and John approach Jesus asking to sit at his right hand and his left hand in glory. And Jesus responds by asking them, are you able to drink the cup that I'm drinking? Or be baptized with the baptism of which I'm to be baptized? When Jesus is talking of baptism here, he's not talking about the baptism with water that we associate with initiation into the faith. He's speaking of the baptism of suffering. His impending death on a cross. To be baptized with Jesus' baptism means to be immersed fully in the mission of God, which includes both joy and suffering. He's inviting his disciples into a deeper participation, just as he's inviting us this morning into a deeper participation. But it's not a participation that leads to earthly power or glory. It's a call to follow him into suffering, to take up the cross, to serve others, just as Jesus came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. For us, this means that following Jesus is not just about experiencing the joy of his resurrection, it's about entering into the fullness of life, which includes the suffering of others. It's about walking with people in their pain, standing with the marginalized, and serving those in need. And in doing that, we participate with God, just as my son does. We participate with God in his mission. And here's the beautiful truth. When we enter into the suffering of life, when we walk alongside those that are in pain, we encounter God in profound ways. The Bible shows us three, what I would call key ways that we encounter the presence of God. It says in Psalm 22 that he inhabits the praises of his people. And so when we gather this morning, participating in morning prayer, lifting praises to God, he inhabits those praises. We encounter Christ in the breaking of bread. We hear about that in Luke 24. Jesus, just as the disciples on the road to Emmaus recognized Jesus in the breaking of bread, we experience that presence that real presence in the Eucharist. And I would argue in shared meals, like the ones we've been having recently at each other's homes. And then finally, we meet God in the suffering of others. The Gospel of Matthew tells us, whatever you did to the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did for me. When we care for those in need, when we sit with those who are suffering, we are encountering the very presence of Christ. And in the end, God invites us to participate in his work, not because he needs our help, but because he wants us to learn, to grow, to encounter him in the fullness of life. The participation often comes through learning obedience, through listening for God's voice, and entering into the suffering of the world. So just like Tanner helps me with tasks around the house, even when I don't need his help, frankly, even when I don't want his help, God doesn't have that in common with us. God invites us into his mission. And as we participate, we are shaped, we are formed, and we encounter God in ways that we could never imagine. So let's listen for God's voice this morning and as we leave. Let's be present with those who suffer. Let's immerse ourselves, baptize ourselves in the work of God, trusting that as we do that, we'll meet Christ in the fullness of life. Amen.